August 24th, 1991. Widnes, England. After receiving a phone call from an unknown person, 42-year-old Vera Anderson asks a neighbor to watch over her son while she steps out, but even though Vera says she will only be gone 10 minutes, she never returns. Hours later, Vera's body is discovered inside her parked car over 4 miles away, and she has been strangled and had her throat slashed. Since witnesses recall seeing Vera at a pub with a man that night, investigators look into the possibility that he might be her killer, but this man is never identified, and the motive for Vera's murder remains unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and for the first time in several months, we're going to be traveling back to the United Kingdom to explore a very bizarre crime. The 1991 murder of Vera Anderson. Out of all the unsolved cold cases I cover on this podcast, the ones which truly terrify me are those in which a seemingly ordinary victim living a seemingly ordinary life wind up being murdered in a crime which almost seems to resemble a professional hit. This case was originally suggested to me just over 2 years ago by a listener named Julia, and even though I had never heard of it before, it has recently got quite a bit of coverage in the British media, as there seems to be an all-new push to get this thing solved. Vera Anderson was a devoted single mother who suddenly received a phone call at her residence at 10 o'clock at night, and while no one knows who made the call or what they said, it somehow compelled Vera to leave her son with a neighbor while she stepped out. Even though Vera promised to only be gone for 10 minutes, she would wind up being murdered inside her car at another location over 4 miles away. Over the years, there have been a number of intriguing leads, including a sighting of Vera with an unidentified man inside a pub that night, as well as a brown car speeding away from the spot where Vera was found dead. For 3 decades, it seems like no one had the faintest idea who killed Vera or what the motive could have been, but 2 years ago, it was announced that a pair of unnamed individuals were arrested on suspicion of murder. But they were soon released without charge, and the authorities have been very tight-lipped about who these 2 people are and why they were suspected of this crime. Over the past few months, investigators have shared a lot of details about the case which were never made public before, and seem to have implied that they believe the murder might have been some sort of professional hit. However, since Vera did not appear to have any known enemies or dark secrets, I have zero idea why she would be targeted. There are a ton of unanswered questions here, but I get the sense that investigators might just be missing one crucial piece of the puzzle which could help them solve this crime. So I thought now would be a good time to do an episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. As our Patreon page has over 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on a regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the murder of Vera Anderson. Our story begins in 1991 in Widnes, England, an industrial town located in the borough of Halton in Cheshire, which had a population of around 55,000 at that time. Our central figure is 42-year-old Veronica Mary Anderson, who goes by the name Vera. Vera resides in the Hadfield Close neighborhood in Widnes and is known for being a devoted single mother to her two children, 19-year-old Lorraine and 7-year-old Neil. She has already gone through 2 divorces and had Lorraine with her first husband before she eventually entered into a lengthy common-law relationship with a man named David Anderson, who happens to be Neil's father. Even though Vera and David have since separated, she still uses his surname. At this particular point, Vera lives with Neil, while Lorraine lives with her boyfriend, as she currently has an 18-month-old daughter of her own and is pregnant with her second child. For the past year, Vera, Lorraine, and another woman have been running a business in which they supply and deliver sandwiches to a number of shops and factories in the Widnes area. Vera is also a regular patron at the Roll-In Truck Stop and Motel located on Tanhouse Lane, and has had relationships with a number of truck drivers she has met there over the years. In fact, Vera became involved in a serious 3-year relationship with one trucker who is planning to move in with her at some point in the near future. Shortly before 10:15 p.m. on the evening of Saturday, August the 24th, Vera received a phone call at her residence, though the identity of the caller and what they said are still unknown to this day. Whatever the case, the call must have been pretty important, because it prompted Vera to wake up her son Neil and bring him over to their next-door neighbor, Elsie Dix. Vera asked Elsie if she could watch over Neil and said something about needing to go pick up her brother. Elsie agreed to the request and noticed Vera unloading some items, including a child's pushchair, some tools, and a red box containing jumper cables, from the trunk of her car, which happened to be a Ford Cortina. Vera said that she would only be gone for about 10 minutes, but after she drove away, this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. Well, nearly 5 hours would pass, and Vera did not return to pick up Neil, and it was not until 3:18 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, August the 25th, when her Ford Cortina was discovered. It was parked on a service road at the Old Tannery Complex, a series of buildings located on Tannery Lane in Penketh, a civil parish in the borough of Warrington. It turned out that Vera had been murdered, as her body was slumped over the steering wheel. Her throat was cut and her artery severed, causing blood to spray all over the vehicle. While there was no murder weapon at the scene, a white blood-stained glove and a length of sash cord ordinarily used in curtains were found nearby. An autopsy would reveal ligature markings on Vera's neck, so it seemed likely that her killer had used the sash cord to strangle her into unconsciousness before slashing her throat. A forensic examination later confirmed that the glove had been worn by the killer and came into contact with Vera, and they likely dropped it accidentally while fleeing the scene. This particular type of glove was ordinarily worn by people who had skin conditions or handled hazardous materials, and it contained the manufacturer's name, Minette. Vera had not been robbed or sexually assaulted, so no one could figure out the motive for the crime. The Old Tannery Complex was located just over 4 miles northeast from Vera's residence, and at the time, it was filled with abandoned, dilapidated buildings which were marked for demolition. The area was known for being a rather unsafe space where drug users often hung out, so it did not seem like a spot that Vera ordinarily would have traveled to. Of course, even though Vera had told Elsie Dix that she needed to pick up her brother, this turned out to be untrue, as it sounds like her brother knew nothing about this. Elsie also found it unusual that Vera had specifically used the phrase, quote, "my brother," since she usually referred to him by his first name. It turned out that Vera had left the lights and TV on inside her residence and was wearing flip-flops when she drove away, so the evidence suggested that she was only planning to be gone for a very short period of time. Vera's daughter Lorraine was asked to identify her body and would have to go through the traumatic ordeal of telling Neil that their mother was not coming back. Lorraine had last paid a visit to Vera's home on the afternoon of August the 24th and felt that her mother was quieter than usual. Lorraine got the sense that there was something Vera wasn't telling her, which could have shed some light on why she decided to leave her house later that night. The crime took everyone by complete surprise, as Vera did not have any known enemies or personal problems. There was nothing to suggest that she had become involved in anything illegal, such as drugs, and she did not have any debt or financial issues. It seemed obvious that whoever phoned Vera before she left had to be involved in her murder, but no one could figure out who the caller might have been. All of Vera's former partners were interviewed, but none of them stood out as potential suspects. The trucker Vera was seeing at that time had actually spent the night at her residence on August the 23rd before she drove him to the roll-in truck stop and motel the following morning. He then got into his truck and left Widnes to travel back to his own home, so he was ruled out as having any involvement in Vera's murder. Investigators tried to figure out Vera's moves after she drove away from her residence. A police patrol car had driven past the Old Tannery Complex at around 10:45 p.m. that night, but they did not recall seeing any vehicles on the service road where Vera's Cortina was later found. However, at around 11 o'clock, a local resident who lived in a house that overlooked the service road said that he glanced out the window and saw a car parked in that spot with its lights on. A married couple who walked through the area at around 1:30 a.m. on August the 25th also reported seeing a car parked in that same spot as well. By the time police discovered the Cortina at 3:18 a.m., its lights were no longer on, and the battery turned out to be flat. The most promising lead were a couple of eyewitnesses who believed they saw a woman matching Vera's description in the Crown and Cushion pub at around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder. The pub was located on Warrington Road in Penketh and was only about a 5-minute drive from Vera's residence and a 2-minute drive from the Old Tannery Complex. The witnesses said they saw Vera drinking and speaking with an unidentified man near the cigarette machine. While it was established that the man and woman were no longer there at closing time, no one could recall actually having seen them leave together. According to those who knew her, the Crown and Cushion pub was not a place that Vera was known to frequent, but a composite sketch was still created and circulated for the unidentified man. He was described as being Caucasian and in his mid-30s to early 40s, with a slim build, short-cut mousy-colored hair, a neatly trimmed mousy-colored mustache, and he was also wearing a fawn-colored jacket. Another interesting lead was provided by a taxi driver who claimed that he picked up a 30-something white male with a mustache at around 1:40 a.m. on August the 25th. The pickup occurred on Warrington Road, only about a half mile from the murder scene, and even though the weather was nice, the man was wearing a raincoat, which the driver found unusual. The driver also noticed that the man's right hand appeared to be bleeding and was covered with a handkerchief, and when he asked him about it, the man said he had gotten injured at a party. The man asked the driver to take him to Widnes and drop him off at the 8 Towers roundabout in the Halton View neighborhood, which was only about 150 yards from Vera's home. It was never conclusively established if the man from the pub and the man from the taxi were the same person, but even though a public plea was sent out for both of them to come forward, they never did. The case would be featured on an episode of the BBC TV program Crime Watch UK, which aired in November of that year. This prompted an anonymous, distressed-sounding woman to call the show's tip line, and she tearfully revealed that she knew who killed Vera, but the call cut off before she could provide any more information. She later made another phone call to the Cheshire Constabulary and repeated her statement, but the call was once again cut off before she could offer any specific details, and I do not believe the woman was ever identified. On the 10-year anniversary of Vera's murder, a £30,000 reward was offered for information leading to the arrest of the killer, but it failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. Vera's daughter Lorraine would eventually get married and changed her last name to Rigby, and frequently did interviews with the media in which she sent out public pleas for information. Lorraine went on to have a total of 4 children, while her brother Neil had 3, but they were both saddened by the fact that their mother was murdered before she had the opportunity to meet 6 of her 7 grandchildren. In September of 2021, the case once again received national exposure when it was featured on an episode of Crime Watch Live and a compelling new lead was shared. Investigators had recently re-interviewed some eyewitnesses, and learned that at around 11:15 p.m. on the night of the murder, a motorist was driving down Tannery Lane when a brown hatchback-style car suddenly emerged from the service road next to the Old Tannery Complex. The vehicle cut the motorist off and nearly collided with her before it sped away. Since the car had emerged from the same service road where Vera's Cortina was later found, and they appeared to be in a hurry, this suggested that it may have been driven by the killer, so information about this vehicle was shared with the public in hopes that it might jog someone's memory. Well, on March the 23rd, 2022, it seemed like there was a potentially major development after it was announced that 2 people had been arrested on suspicion of Vera's murder. While their names were not released publicly, it was revealed that the suspects were a 70-year-old man from Widnes and a 61-year-old woman from Warrington. However, 2 days later, it was announced that they had both been released under investigation pending further inquiries. Thus far, no charges have been filed against either of these individuals, though 18 months later, the police did confirm that the male suspect was still under investigation. In February of 2024, just 3 months before the release of this episode, the Manchester Evening News published an extensive new article about the case and filmed an interview with the current lead investigator, Detective Chief Inspector Adam Waller of the Cheshire Constabulary. For the very first time, a number of previously undisclosed details about the murder were released to the public. It was revealed that an 8mm blank cartridge from a handgun had been recovered from the footwell of Vera's Cortina, and even though she had not been shot, investigators theorized that the killer may have discharged a firearm in an attempt to scare Vera and prevent her from fleeing the scene. An empty box for Embassy Regal brand cigarettes was found in front of the Cortina, and Vera's DNA was on wrapping inside the box. But oddly, Embassy Regal was not a brand that Vera ordinarily smoked, and she had actually bought a packet of her preferred brand of cigarettes the previous day. It turned out there were injuries to Vera's lower legs to indicate that she may have kicked at the car's foot pedals while struggling with her killer, and police confirmed that the car's key was still in the ignition when Vera was found, though the key's fob had been ripped off. It was also now revealed that the killer had torn a large chunk of Vera's hair from the left side of her scalp, which could not be found at the scene. This prompted DCI Waller to share a theory that Vera's murder may have been a professional hit, and that the killer took a clump of her hair in order to prove to the person that hired them that the job was done. Police also released some CCTV images of a man and a younger woman who were captured exiting a Tesco Extra store on Winwick Road in Warrington on March the 9th, 2013. They said that they wanted to speak to these 2 individuals in connection with this case, and within 2 days of the image's release, it was announced that the man and the woman had both been identified and tracked down, and they were happy to voluntarily cooperate. However, no further details have been released about why exactly these 2 people are considered to be important to the investigation. During his interview with the Manchester Evening News, DCI Waller also revealed that the alleged sighting of Vera in the Crown and Cushion pub on the night of her murder may have been nothing more than a red herring, and that the eyewitnesses possibly mistook a completely different woman for Vera. According to Vera's friends and family, whenever she went out to a pub or a social event at a public place, she would always dress up in nice clothing, fix her hair, and put on makeup. But when Vera left her residence that night, she did none of those things, and was instead dressed in very casual clothing, including a t-shirt, blue blazer jacket, and flip-flops. The barmaid from the pub also recalled serving the woman a lager while she was there, whereas Vera's preferred drink was stout or pale ale. Another theory pushed forward by Waller is that since the Old Tannery Complex had a number of warehouses where items could be stored, the person who phoned Vera that night could have asked her to pick something up from there. This provided a potential explanation for why Vera emptied her car trunk before she drove away. When DCI Waller was asked about whether there was DNA evidence available, he responded, quote, "We don't have any DNA profile from the scene that we can attribute 100% to the murderer. We have lots of partial profiles used to run against anyone who is a suspect. We have looked at every single exhibit from the scene, and had them re-examined by forensic scientists to see what more we can do." End quote. During the past few months, there definitely seems to have been a concerted push to try and solve this case, but after 3 decades, there are still no conclusive answers about who was actually responsible for the murder of Vera Anderson. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So like I mentioned in the intro, I'm always haunted by cold cases in which someone was brutally murdered in what appears to be a professional hit, but a thorough investigation into the victim's background fails to turn up any insight into what could have compelled someone to do this to them. In some of these crimes, I wonder if mistaken identity occurred and the wrong person wound up being murdered for reasons they had absolutely nothing to do with, but here, the evidence clearly seems to indicate that Vera Anderson was specifically targeted and the perpetrator may have lured her to her death. The whole situation is very reminiscent of another case from the United Kingdom, which I covered on minisode number 19 of this podcast, and that's the 1991 murder of 43-year-old Penny Bell, which, ironically enough, took place just over 2 months before this crime. Penny was a wife and mother who did not seem to have any known enemies, but after she left her house for an alleged appointment one morning, she wound up being stabbed no less than 50 times inside her car in a public parking lot, and even though the killer likely would have been covered in blood after this, they somehow managed to escape unseen in broad daylight. However, I guess a key difference between the two cases is that for unknown reasons, Penny withdrew £8,500 from her bank account shortly before she was killed, and it was never accounted for, so it's possible that robbery may have been the primary motive for that crime. But Vera Anderson was not robbed or sexually assaulted, so the motive for her murder is unclear. And in recent years, investigators have hinted that they believe her death may have been a professional hit, and an outside party hired someone to kill her. It's not entirely clear why they believe this, but the fact that 2 different people, a man and a woman, were arrested on suspicion of murder 2 years ago would seemingly lend credence to the idea that this was a murder for hire plot. But of course the big unanswered question is, why? Before we start talking about this angle, it's also worth mentioning that investigators have looked into the possibility that Vera may have been the victim of an unidentified murderer known as the East Lancs Ripper. This nickname came about because 2 of these murders took place in the same general area near the A580, which is officially known as the Liverpool East Lancashire Road, aka the East Lancs. And the first murder occurred on October the 18th, 1988, the same night when ITV broadcast part 2 of a multi-episode miniseries about Jack the Ripper, which starred Michael Caine, and was released to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the original Whitechapel murders. The first victim was 31-year-old Linda Donaldson, and like many of the original Whitechapel victims, she was a sex worker and was brutally butchered. Linda's nude body was found at Winwick Lane in the village of Loughton. She was fatally stabbed twice in the back before 8 additional stab wounds were inflicted on her body following her death. An attempt was made to decapitate Linda, and both of her breasts were removed and never found, so needless to say, parallels were made to Jack the Ripper, and earned this killer the East Lancs Ripper moniker. The second alleged Ripper victim, 27-year-old Maria Requena, would be discovered in Pennington Flash Lake in the town of Lee on January 6, 1991. Like Linda Donaldson, Maria was believed to be a sex worker, and while her exact manner of death was strangulation, her body was dismembered with a chainsaw or a circular saw before her remains were placed in 5 separate plastic bags and tossed into the lake. Since each victim's remains were found less than 3 miles from each other, investigators looked into the possibility that both crimes were committed by the same perpetrator, though they acknowledged that there is no forensic evidence to conclusively prove this. The third potential East Lancs Ripper victim was 23-year-old Julie Finley, whose nude body was found in a field close to the Wheatsheaf Hotel in the village of Rainford on August 6, 1994. Julie was known for being a heroin and cocaine user who was friends with sex workers, though her family insisted that she was not a sex worker herself. Since Julie's murder took place about 15 miles west from the other two murders, in relatively close proximity to the A580, investigators have explored the possibility that the same perpetrator was responsible, but while Julie was strangled to death, she was not decapitated or dismembered. While it's never been proven that the three crimes are linked, they are all still unsolved, and a number of convicted murderers have been looked at as potential suspects, including Christopher Hallowell, David Smith, and Alan Kite, who was nicknamed the Midlands Ripper. So Vera Anderson's name has been pushed forward as a potential victim of the East Lancs Ripper, mostly due to the fact that her murder took place only about 15 to 20 miles south of these other crimes. But other than the fact that Vera was strangled and had her throat slashed, I really don't see any other connections, and it sounds like investigators have all but ruled out the possibility of the East Lancs Ripper being responsible. In fact, it's never even been proven that there is an East Lancs Ripper, as for all we know, this could just be 4 separate murders committed by 4 separate individuals. The key difference is that Linda Donaldson, Maria Requena, and Julie Finley all appeared to live high-risk lifestyles involving sex work and/or drugs, so they easily could have crossed paths with a random stranger who decided to murder them. That was definitely not the case with Vera, as her murder seemed planned and premeditated, and she was likely killed by someone she knew, who was somehow able to convince her to leave her house and drive somewhere after a late-night phone call. So from this point on, I'm going to be operating under the assumption that Vera was not murdered by the East Lancs Ripper, though it would be nice to see justice for those other 3 victims someday. Anyway, one of the main reasons I decided to do an episode about this case now is that there seems to have been a major push to solve this since the start of 2024. The authorities have shared a number of new details about the murder which they had previously withheld from the public, so I get the sense that they may be trying anything they can in hopes of getting that one final piece of evidence which will allow them to make an arrest and file charges. I've researched a number of cold cases from the United Kingdom, and I can tell you that law enforcement over there is far more stringent about releasing information to the public than law enforcement in the United States. And that only means that I have a ton of unanswered questions about developments from the past few years. So 2 years ago, it was publicly announced that 2 people had been arrested on suspicion of Vera's murder, but that doesn't automatically mean the case is solved. Whenever someone in the UK is arrested on suspicion of murder, that usually means they can be detained and questioned for between 24 to 96 hours, depending on the circumstances and such variables as the seriousness of the crime. But if the suspect is not charged within that window of time, the authorities have to release them. I think there's often a last-ditch hope that if the suspect is guilty, this arrest will prompt them to finally confess or reveal incriminating information. However, that obviously didn't happen here, since the 2 suspects in Vera's case were released within 24 hours, and unless charges are filed, the identities of the people who were arrested will not be released publicly. All we know about the suspects here is that they were a 70-year-old man from Widnes, which was Vera's hometown, and a 61-year-old woman from Warrington, which is just a stone's throw away from the murder scene. But we don't know their names or any other details about why law enforcement thought they might be involved in the murder and felt compelled to bring them in. Since 2 years have passed and they've never been charged, there obviously isn't enough evidence to conclusively prove their complicity, even if they are guilty. One of the most recent developments, which only occurred just over 2 months ago, is when law enforcement said they were trying to identify a man and woman who were captured on CCTV footage at a Tesco Extra store in Warrington in March of 2013. They were quickly identified and apparently cooperated with investigators, but I have zero idea why 2 people from CCTV footage in 2013 would have any relevance to a murder from 1991. But obviously, there seem to be a lot of things going on behind the scenes which the general public is not privy to, so I can only assume that law enforcement is gradually putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So here are the facts we do know. Shortly after 10 p.m. on the night she was killed, Vera received a phone call at home, and while we have no idea who the caller was or what they said, it was important enough to compel Vera to wake up her son Neil and take him to her next-door neighbor so that she could go somewhere. It sounds like it was very uncharacteristic for Vera to make a last-second decision to just drop her child on someone that late at night without notice, so whatever Vera had planned, it's almost like she considered it to be some sort of emergency. One detail which has never really been addressed publicly is whether or not the police checked phone records to find out where the call to Vera's residence originated from. I would think they would have had this technology back in 1991, but police have never confirmed or denied if they did this. For all we know, perhaps the call was traced to a public payphone somewhere, but they just have no way of knowing who actually made it. Vera told her neighbor, Elsie Dix, that she had to pick up her brother, but this turned out not to be true, so I think it's safe to say that she didn't want anyone to know what she was really doing, which is why she fabricated a cover story. But the fact that Vera went to the trouble of emptying everything from the trunk of her car could be a sign that she was planning to pick up something for someone else. Whatever the case, Vera told Elsie that she would only be gone 10 minutes, and if she was intending to drive to the Old Tannery Complex, collect something, and then bring it back home, she probably could have done that during this window of time. If Vera had a secret date or a rendezvous planned, then I'm not sure why she would tell Elsie she'd be back so quickly. And let's not forget that she also left the lights and TV on inside the house and did not take her purse with her. Now, for many years, the biggest lead in this case were the eyewitness sightings of Vera in the Crown and Cushion pub in Penketh, where she was supposedly seen chatting and having a drink with an unidentified man. But these sightings were never officially confirmed, and in recent months, investigators have acknowledged that this lead may be a red herring, as the witnesses could have seen an entirely different woman who looked like Vera, or were even mistaken about the night this took place. But technically, if the woman was Vera, the timeline would still fit. She left her house at 10:15 p.m., the sightings took place at around 10:30, and the pub was only a 5-minute drive away. One witness may have seen Vera's car parked on the service road at the Old Tannery Complex at 11 p.m., and since that location was only about a 2-minute drive from the pub, Vera would have had time to stop there for a drink and make it to the service road by 11 o'clock. One reason that Vera's loved ones became skeptical about her being at the pub is that this was not an establishment she was known to frequent, and she would usually do her hair, put on makeup, and dress up in nicer clothes than a t-shirt and flip-flops whenever she went out. That is a valid point, but theoretically, if Vera received a last-second phone call from a secret suitor asking her to meet him, and she only had a limited amount of time to leave her son with someone else, I could see her not going to the trouble of doing this. But like I just mentioned, Vera said that she was only planning to be gone for about 10 minutes, and at the very least, I'd expect her to bring her purse along if she was spending time in a public place. And of course, what would be the purpose of emptying out the trunk of your car if all you were planning to do was have a drink with someone at a pub? The main reason Vera might have felt the need to be so secretive about meeting a man is because she was involved with a serious relationship with a truck driver who was hoping to move in with her sometime in the near future. It sounds like this trucker and all of Vera's former partners were thoroughly investigated by the police, and none of them stood out as potential suspects, so if Vera was killed by someone whom she was having an affair or secret relationship with, then I'm guessing that no one else would have known about them. Vera's regular hangout was the Roll-In Truck Stop and Motel, so if she didn't want anyone else to know about this other man, then it would make sense that she would meet him at an unfamiliar establishment like the Crown and Cushion pub, where there would be less chance of her being seen and recognized. But for now, let's operate under the assumption that this sighting is false, and Vera never went to the pub. Regardless of whether or not she was there, we still don't know why she ultimately wound up at a dilapidated area like the Old Tannery Complex. Like I mentioned earlier, this was not exactly known for being the safest area in the world, and the whole complex has since been demolished and turned into a housing estate. The only theory which has been pushed forward that makes sense to me is if someone asked Vera to pick up something that was being stored there, but instead decided to kill her. While the first reported sighting of Vera's Cortina on the side road took place at 11 p.m., it was from a witness who saw the vehicle from a distance at night, so he couldn't get a close enough look to positively identify it as being hers. But given that the car was parked in pretty much the exact same spot, I'd say there's a good chance it was the Cortina, particularly since the witness reported seeing its lights on. The car's battery was flat by the time it was discovered at 3:18 a.m., which would make sense if the lights were left on after the murder took place, causing the battery to run down over the course of the next 4 hours. Even though the sighting occurred at 11 o'clock, this only happened because the witness glanced out the window at that time. It only would have taken Vera about 10 minutes to drive from her house to the side road, so for all we know, she possibly arrived there earlier, though a passing patrol car was certain that they did not see any vehicles parked on the side road at 10:45 p.m. Alternatively, Vera could have initially driven elsewhere to meet someone before she wound up at the Old Tannery Complex. For decades, the forensic pathologist estimated that Vera's death took place sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 2:30 a.m. that night, but it was only about 3 years ago when investigators learned about the eyewitness sighting of a brown hatchback-style car emerging from the side road at 11:15 p.m. and speeding away in such a hurry that it nearly got into a collision. If this sighting is accurate and the car was being driven by the killer, then Vera's estimated time of death would be narrowed down considerably. As far as I can tell, the witness who saw the car parked on the side road at 11 o'clock did not report seeing a second vehicle there, so perhaps Vera was waiting for someone at that point. This would also mean that yet another major lead from the early stages of the investigation may have been nothing more than a red herring. As you might recall, at around 1:40 a.m., a taxi driver reported picking up an unidentified white male about a half mile from the murder scene before he dropped him off about 150 yards from Vera's home. There were a number of reasons to suspect this guy might be involved in the murder, as he bore a resemblance to the man from the Crown and Cushion pub, his right hand appeared to be bleeding, and he was wearing a raincoat on a nice, non-rainy night, which could have been an attempt to conceal blood on his clothing. But even though this lead got mentioned during the earliest media coverage of this case, I don't see it get mentioned anymore, and this may be due to the sighting of the brown car. If it was driven by the person responsible for Vera's murder, then it's extremely unlikely that the killer would still be hanging around the area over 2 hours later seeking a ride from a taxi. So perhaps this lead doesn't have any significance after all, and the man in the taxi really was telling the truth when he said he injured his hand at a party. Now, let's assume that the police's theory about the killer luring Vera to the Old Tannery Complex under the pretense of asking her to pick something up is correct. It's unlikely that Vera would have traveled there that late at night unless she was asked by someone she knew and trusted, but then how did things escalate into violence? Until recently, the authorities never revealed that an empty cigarette box was found at the scene, and since it had traces of Vera's DNA on it and was not a brand she ordinarily smoked, perhaps the killer was the one who brought it there, and he may have even offered Vera a cigarette. We also recently learned that a blank cartridge from a handgun was found inside the Cortina, as the killer may have fired off a shot in order to frighten Vera. But they never actually fired a shot into her body, instead going to the trouble of strangling her with some sash cord and slashing her throat, which seems like major rage and overkill. If that wasn't enough, it turned out that a large chunk of hair was pulled out of Vera's scalp, and since it could not be found at the scene, the killer may have decided to keep it as some sort of twisted memento. Or, alternatively, if this was a professional hit, the hair would be presented as evidence that the job had been completed. But once again, why would anyone go to the trouble of doing this to an ordinary, law-abiding single mother like Vera, who did not appear to have any enemies or dark secrets? Since there was no robbery or sexual assault, what exactly was the motive here? Since Vera's favorite hangout was the roll-in truck stop and motel, and she was dating a truck driver, I have to wonder if perhaps the killer could have been a completely different trucker she met there, perhaps someone who was romantically interested in her and became angry when she did not return his advances. If this trucker was from out of town and did not return to the area after the murder took place, that could explain why he's never been identified and no one has ever been able to connect him to Vera. Obviously, if this guy was some sort of creepy, obsessive stalker, it's unlikely he would have been able to convince Vera to leave her house late at night, unless he was pretending to be someone else during the phone call or enlisted another person to make the call and help them commit the crime. I guess it's possible that Vera could have been conducting a consensual affair with another man and did not tell anyone else about it. She could have trusted this person enough to meet him, but had no interest in a long-term relationship, and when she told him that things had gotten serious with her other trucker boyfriend and they were planning to move in together, this guy could have reacted badly, meaning this may have been a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion rather than being premeditated. Vera's daughter, Lorraine, went to visit her on the afternoon of the murder and said her mother seemed quiet and secretive about something, and while it's possible that what happened has retroactively caused Lorraine to read too much into this, perhaps Vera really did have something on her mind and she was possibly expecting a phone call later that night. Now, when this case was originally featured on Crime Watch UK back in 1991, it was reported that an anonymous woman called her tip line who was crying and said she knew who killed Vera before the call abruptly cut off. For years, the authorities sent out a public plea for this woman to come forward, and while I'm not sure if she ever did, this whole situation seems all the more interesting when you consider that a man and a woman were both arrested on suspicion of murder 2 years ago. So could it be possible that this was the same woman who called Crime Watch? Even if the woman did not personally murder Vera, was she somehow involved or know the identity of the perpetrator? If this was a professional hit, does that mean police believe that one of these individuals committed the crime while the other set it in motion? Other than their ages, the only other thing we know about them is that the 70-year-old man was from Widnes and the 61-year-old woman was from Warrington, so that would seem to indicate that they were not a couple at the time they were arrested. In September of last year, police confirmed that the male suspect was still under investigation, but I noticed that they didn't specifically say the same thing about the female suspect, so I don't know if we should take that as an indication that she has since been ruled out. Since investigators have released very few details publicly, we can only speculate about this whole situation. The two key pieces of physical evidence in this case are the bloody glove and sash cord which were found at the murder scene, and the fact that they were left behind in the first place might be an indication that the perpetrator was sloppy and did not have much experience at this sort of thing. In fact, it's possible that they only intended on strangling Vera to death, but when they realized they could not exert enough force to finish the job, that's when they decided to slash her throat. If this crime had taken place today, and those items were left at the murder scene, it's possible that police may have already been able to solve this thing. But DNA profiling in criminal investigations was still in its infancy back in 1991. It's been established that Vera's blood was on the glove, but it's not quite clear if any of these items contain the killer's DNA. And if they do, the DNA is yet to be matched to anyone, and I can only presume it hasn't been linked to the man and woman who were arrested 2 years ago. Here's another quote from DCI Adam Waller, which summarizes this whole situation. Quote, "There is stuff that we have sent off that was never sent off in the day because at the time, DNA was in its infancy. Unfortunately, in crimes from this era, the way exhibits were handled and treated meant a lot of potential DNA profiles were contaminated or degraded over time. We are mindful that every time you examine an exhibit for forensics, you take a little bit of it away and reduce your ability to look at it in the future." End quote. So sadly, it's possible that forensic evidence will not provide the smoking gun required to solve this case. With the information which has been released, I really don't have much idea who committed this crime or what the motive could have been, but all I do know is that Vera's children, grandchildren, and everyone who loved and cared about her have had to spend the past 3 decades dealing with the grief over her murder, and they deserve answers about what happened. I get the sense that the authorities are doing everything in their power to try and close this case, and may just be missing one piece of the puzzle, so if you happen to have any information about the murder of Vera Anderson, please contact the Cheshire Constabulary. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the disappearance of Dee Dee Rosenthal, who was the apparent victim of a murder, but even after her supposed killer confessed, her remains were never found. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a very odd missing persons case, the 1998 disappearance of 98-year-old Walter Dunson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, Laura and Elena M. Thank you all so much for your support. Once more, I wanted to remind everyone that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is taking place in only 2 weeks at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May the 21st until June the 2nd. And since I covered a case from the United Kingdom this week, I should also mention that I've been booked to appear at this year's CrimeCon UK event, which is taking place at 133 Houndsditch in London on September the 21st and 22nd. If you would like to purchase tickets to either event, we have a specialized promo code to get a 10% discount, so please visit crimecon.com or crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COOL24. Once again, that's crimecon.com and crimecon.co.uk, and the promo code is COOL24 for 10% off tickets to both events. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.